Peacemaker stood in the first class, line dressed, simply a stark contrast to the extravagance around him. Among the elegantly dressed travelers, one man's eyes narrowed in disdain. His tailored suit, polished shoes, and air of entitlement screamed superiority to him. Peacemaker didn't belong here in this exclusive space reserved for the elite. He sneered, convinced that this outsider was out of place, but in just a few moments, something would happen that would not only shatter his arrogance, but also leave the entire flight in stunned silence. Before we continue this story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel. We have another incredible story waiting for you. Peacemaker's presence, contrasting sharply with the luxury surrounding him, dressed in a simple plaid shirt, worn-out jeans, and scuffed boots. He carried an old backpack that looked like it had seen the world. There was nothing extravagant about him, yet something about his quiet demeanor set him apart. While the other passengers fidgeted with impatience or scrolled through their phones, Peacemaker remained still, observing his surroundings with a serene expression. He seemed unaffected by the chaos, exuding a peaceful energy that was rare in such a crowded place. Just behind him in line stood Victor Harding, a businessman who exuded confidence and status. He wore an expensive tailored suit, polished shoes, and cologne that demanded attention. His movements were precise, almost rehearsed, as if every step was meant to affirm his superiority. When his eyes landed on Peacemaker, he couldn't help but scoff, his lips curling into an amused smirk. He leaned slightly forward and spoke with a mocking tone. "First class, huh? You never know who might show up here these days," he said, expecting some sort of reaction. Peacemaker turned his head slightly and met Victor's gaze with calm eyes. "Yeah, the world is full of surprises," he replied simply. Victor frowned, clearly expecting a different response. He studied Peacemaker for a moment before pushing further. "Look, nothing personal, but you don't seem like the type who flies like this. It's rare to see someone so casual in first class." Kananu remained unbothered, offering a small smile. "Maybe first class is just a place, not a type of person," he said, his voice even. Victor chuckled, shaking his head. He had no idea that this quiet man would soon challenge everything he believed about status, success, and what it truly meant to belong. Victor let out a short laugh, adjusting the cuffs of his pristine suit. As he glanced at Peacemaker again, he still couldn't believe the man standing in front of him was in the same line as him, waiting to board first class. Everything about Peacemaker seemed out of place. His simple clothes, his well-worn boots, and the relaxed way he carried himself. It made no sense to Victor. First class was meant for people who had earned their place, for those who had worked hard and knew how to enjoy the rewards of success. And yet, here was this man standing so effortlessly, as if he belonged without having to prove it. As the line moved forward, Victor decided he wasn't done. He tilted his head slightly, a smirk playing on his lips as he glanced at the man beside him. His voice carried the confidence of someone who already thought he knew the answer. "So what do you do for a living?" he asked, his tone casual but laced with subtle judgment. Peacemaker, who had been calmly adjusting his backpack, looked up, his expression unreadable. He didn't seem bothered by the question, nor did he show any reaction to Victor's tone. In the same composed manner he had held since they first stood in line, he responded, "I work in film." Victor raised an eyebrow, suppressing a chuckle. The answer was vague, almost deliberately, so he leaned in slightly, his smirk widening. "Oh, I see," he said, drawing out the words as if he had already figured Peacemaker out. "Commercials, indie projects." His voice dripped with condescension, as if placing Peacemaker in a smaller, less significant category. Peacemaker shook his head slightly. "A small, almost knowing smile appearing on his face, something like that. He said, his voice even and composed. Victor leaned back in his spot, feeling reassured by his own assumption. I've always found it interesting how people try to find their place. He mused, pausing deliberately, as if setting up for some grand insight. He glanced around the cabin before turning back to Peacemaker, but sometimes certain spaces just aren't meant for everyone, like first class for instance. Peacemaker remained silent for a moment. His expression didn't shift, nor did he seem offended. If anything, he appeared completely unfazed by Victor's comment. Then, in the same calm, unshaken manner, he responded, I think we all have our place, and sometimes it's exactly where we are. Victor scoffed, unimpressed. He had expected defensiveness, an attempt to justify being in first class. Instead, he was met with quiet confidence, something that unsettled him in a way he couldn't quite put into words. Letting out a quiet chuckle, he shook his head and moved toward his seat. The conversation had been mildly entertaining, but as far as he was concerned, it was over. However, as he settled in, he glanced at his ticket and then looked up, only to freeze in disbelief. Peacemaker was lowering his backpack into the seat right next to him. You've got to be kidding me, Victor muttered under his breath, his voice barely above a whisper. Of all the places on the plane, of all the possible seating arrangements, this man, this casually dressed, unimpressive, water-drinking man, had to be sitting beside him. Peacemaker, still perfectly composed, gave him a small nod and a polite smile. Looks like we're traveling together, he said simply. Victor exhaled sharply, crossing his arms as he shifted in his seat. He had spent the last several minutes subtly questioning whether Peacemaker belonged in first class, and now he was stuck next to him for the entire flight. It wasn't just an unfortunate coincidence. It felt like a cruel joke as other passengers settled in and the flight attendants moved through the cabin, making their final checks. Victor decided he wasn't going to let this go. He turned slightly toward Peacemaker, his smirk returning, though this time there was a hint of amusement in his tone rather than outright condescension. So he said, tilting his head, tell me, how does a guy like you end up flying first class? His voice was light, almost playful, but beneath the surface, the arrogance remained. He wasn't really asking. He was testing, waiting to see if Peacemaker would finally reveal what he believed to be the truth, that he didn't belong there. Peacemaker adjusted his seatbelt and glanced at him, his expression unreadable. I bought a ticket, he said, his voice as calm as ever. Victor chuckled at the simple response. Right, he said, nodding as if he had expected that kind of vague answer. I guess I just mean it's rare to see someone so casual up here. First class is usually for people who know how to appreciate it. Peacemaker tilted his head slightly as if considering the statement. Maybe appreciation isn't about appearance, he said. Maybe it's about perspective. Victor smirked, lifting his chin slightly. Perspective, huh? He mused. Well, in my experience, people who talk about simplicity are usually the ones who don't have much choice. Peacemaker met his gaze unfazed. Or maybe they're the ones who have already figured out what really matters. Victor smirk faltered just for a second. Something about Peacemaker's quiet confidence made him uneasy, though he couldn't quite understand why. Victor took a slow sip of his champagne, watching Keanu with a mixture of curiosity and irritation. There was something about this man, his calmness, his lack of reaction to provocation, that unsettled him. Most people would have felt the need to defend themselves, to prove they belonged in first class, but Peacemaker simply existed unbothered, as if he had nothing to prove to anyone. The flight attendant approached offering drinks to the first class passengers Victor made sure to be. "Noticed a glass of your finest champagne." "Please," he said, flashing a confident smile, something that matches the exclusivity of this seat, the flight. Attendant nodded politely, used to passengers like him when she turned to Peacemaker. He gave her a small smile. "Just water, please." Victor let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. "Water?" he asked, his voice laced with amusement. "Don't tell me you're going to waste a first class experience on water." Peacemaker took the bottle from the flight attendant and twisted off the cap. "I'm fine with this," he said, taking a small sip. "Sometimes simplicity is enough." Victor narrowed his eyes as if trying to decode Peacemaker's response. "Yeah," he said, slowly leaning back into his seat. "I guess that works for people who settle for less. Not everyone is born to enjoy the best life has to offer." Peacemaker glanced at him, but there was no offense in his gaze, only a quiet patience. "Maybe the best is different for everyone." Victor exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Or maybe people who say that just never had access to what really matters." He counted, his tone sharpening. Peacemaker didn't respond right away. He simply leaned back in his seat, his fingers lightly tapping the cap of his water bottle. "Maybe," he finally said, his voice even, "or maybe the things we think matter don't actually mean as much as we believe." Victor frowned. The conversation wasn't going the way he had expected. He had meant to put Peacemaker in his place, to make him feel small, but instead, it felt as if the man was subtly shifting the balance, exposing something Victor wasn't ready to face. Victor took another sip of his champagne, trying to mask his growing frustration. The way Peacemaker responded, calmly measured and unshaken, was starting to get under his skin. He had expected a reaction, maybe even an argument, but instead he was met with nothing but quiet confidence. The more Victor tried to assert his superiority, the more it seemed to slip through his fingers. The flight attendant moved through first class, collecting empty glasses and offering refills. As she passed their row, Victor leaned slightly toward Kananu, determined to regain control of the conversation. "You know," he began, swirling the champagne in his glass, "life is kind of like flying first class. You work hard, you earn your place, and then you get to enjoy it. But some people," he gave Peacemaker a pointed look, "some people just get lucky." Peacemaker remained silent for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, with the same unshaken calm, he responded, "Luck or hard work, we all end up in the same place when the flight lands, don't we?" Victor's smile faltered slightly. A few passengers around them, who had been discreetly listening, exchanged glances. The atmosphere in first class had shifted. What had started as a casual conversation was beginning to feel like something much more significant. Victor let out a small laugh, though it sounded forced. "I wouldn't say that. Some of us are simply on a higher level. Not everyone understands the value of being here." Peacemaker leaned forward slightly, crossing his arms. "I think the value of being here," he gestured around the cabin, "isn't about what you have, but how you treat others." A quiet hush fell over the surrounding passengers. Some nodded slightly in agreement, while others gave Victor disapproving glances. He noticed the shift, the way the energy in the cabin had turned against him. Victor forced another chuckle, trying to play it off. "That's a nice thought, first class self-help philosophy. Maybe you should consider giving motivational talks." Peacemaker simply smiled, turning his gaze back to the window. He didn't need to say anything else. His presence, his composure, spoke louder than any words. Victor shifted in his seat suddenly, feeling more uncomfortable than he ever had in a space he once considered his own. Victor felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The first class cabin, once a place where he moved with. Effortless confidence now felt different. He could feel the eyes of the other. Passengers on him, their silent judgment. Lingering in the air, he had started this conversation believing he was in control. But somehow, Peacemaker's quiet presence had turned it into something else entirely. Still, Victor wasn't ready to back down. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice, but keeping his smirk intact, you know. What's funny, he said, the people who talk the most about humility and simplicity are usually the ones who don't have much to show for themselves. Peacemaker turned to look at him, his expression calm, but direct. And I've noticed that the people who talk the most about what they have, he said, his voice even, are often the ones who feel the emptiest. Inside for a moment, Victor was at a loss for words. The sentence lingered in the air, heavier than he had expected. He opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. His fingers tightened slightly around the saint of his champagne glass. The silence between them grew. Passengers nearby exchanged subtle glances. Even the flight attendant who had been refilling drinks hesitated for a brief second. Before moving on, it was clear that Victor was no longer the dominant force in the conversation. He forced a chuckle, trying to shake off the discomfort. Look, I don't mean to be rude, he said, straightening his posture, but the world is competitive. If you don't show what you have, people ignore you. That's just how things work. Peacemaker leaned back in his seat, watching Victor with a quiet kind of understanding. Maybe, he said, but I think real success doesn't need to be shouted about. It speaks for itself. The words hit harder than Victor expected. He tried to dismiss them, but something about the way Peacemaker said it so effortlessly, so surely, made it impossible to ignore. He had spent his life making sure people saw his success, that they knew who he was. But now, sitting next to a man who didn't need to prove anything, he felt something unexpected. Doubt. For the first time in a long while, Victor wasn't sure if he had truly won anything at all. Victor shifted uncomfortably in his seat, the weight of Peacemaker's words settling over him like an unwelcome realization. He had always believed that power and influence were meant to be displayed, that success only mattered if others could see it. But now, as he sat across from a man who carried himself with quiet confidence without any need for validation, he couldn't help but feel like he was missing something still. He wasn't ready to admit defeat. He straightened his shoulders, forcing his usual smirk back onto his face. Cheap philosophy, he scoffed. It might sound nice, but the real world doesn't work that way. Peacemaker remained unbothered, his gaze steady. The real world is made up of people, he said, and in the end, how we treat others says more about who we are than anything else. Victor exhaled sharply, frustrated by Peacemaker's unwavering demeanor. He had expected an argument, a debate that he could win. Instead, he was met with a truth so simple, yet so difficult to counter. Around them, other passengers subtly nodded, their expressions making it clear that they weren't on Victor's side. He could feel it now, the shift in perception. He was no longer the one in control of this conversation. The confidence he had built through years of success and wealth suddenly felt hollow. He was used to admiration, to people looking at him with respect or envy, but now all he saw in their eyes was quiet disapproval. Victor clenched his jaw, glancing around as if searching for an escape. He had never felt this exposed, this vulnerable, in a setting where he was supposed to be untouchable. He had spent his life ensuring that he was always the most important person in the room, but for the first time he realized that true respect couldn't be bought. It had to be earned. Peacemaker didn't press the moment any further. He simply leaned back in his seat as if the conversation was over, but for Victor, the words lingered, echoing in a way he couldn't ignore. For the first time, he found himself questioning everything he had built his life around. Victor sat in silence, his mind replaying every word of the conversation. The tension that had built between them wasn't one of open hostility, but something deeper, a quiet confrontation between two vastly different ways of seeing the world. He had spent years believing that success was about proving yourself, about making sure others saw and acknowledged your achievements. And yet, here was a man who carried no proof, no outward signs of wealth or power, and yet somehow commanded more respect than Victor ever had. The flight attendant returned, moving through first class with practice deficiency. As she reached their row, she smiled politely and spoke in a voice loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Mr. Peacemaker, the captain asked me to inform you that your connection in Tokyo is confirmed. He also sends his best regards." The name hit Victor like a sudden shock. His breath caught, his fingers tightening around his armrest. Peacemaker. Peacemaker. He turned slowly, staring at the man he had spent the entire flight subtly mocking, the man he had judged based on his appearance, assuming he didn't belong. And yet it was Victor who now felt out of place. A murmur rippled through the first class cabin. A few passengers exchanged glances, some nodding in recognition, others whispering among themselves. The atmosphere shifted once again, not because Kananu had revealed his identity, but because it had been revealed for him. Victor swallowed hard, struggling to process what had just happened. His arrogance, his attempts to put Peacemaker down, all felt embarrassingly small now. He had spent the entire flight assuming he was the one in control, yet he had unknowingly been speaking to someone whose name alone commanded global respect, not for wealth or power, but for kindness, humility, and integrity. Peacemaker, however, remained unchanged. He turned back to Victor, his expression as calm as ever. "Is something wrong?" he asked, his voice carrying number malice. No mockery, just quiet understanding. Victor opened his mouth, but no words came. For the first time in a long while, he felt truly, undeniably humbled. Victor felt the weight of his own arrogance settle over him like a crushing force. He had spent the entire flight trying to assert dominance, convinced that Peacemaker was just another man who didn't belong in first class, but now faced with the truth, he couldn't ignore the burning shame creeping up his spine. He struggled to find the right words, his confidence faltering. I had no idea." He finally muttered, his voice quieter than before. "I didn't know who you were." Peacemaker gave a small knowing smile. "I didn't think it was necessary," he said simply. "I don't usually use my name as a calling card." Victor sat back in his seat, his mind racing. He wasn't sure what was worse, the fact that he had judged Peacemaker so wrongly, or the realization that his judgment wouldn't have changed if Peacemaker had been someone else. That was the part that truly stung. If Peacemaker had just been an ordinary man, someone without fame or influence, would Victor have treated him any differently? The answer made him uncomfortable. He glanced around the cabin and saw that the other passengers had taken notice of the shift. Some looked at him with subtle disapproval, others with quiet amusement, as if waiting to see how he would react now that the truth was out. He felt exposed in a way he had never experienced before. "I didn't mean to offend you," Victor said hastily, as if trying to salvage the situation. I didn't know who I was." Talking to Peacemaker's gaze remained steady. "Victor," he said, his voice gentle but firm, "the truth doesn't change just because you now know my name. What matters is how we choose to treat people, whether we recognize them or not." Victor swallowed hard. He had no witty retort this time, no clever comeback, because for the first time he wasn't trying to win. He was realizing just how much he had already lost. Peacemaker leaned. Back in his seat, his words lingering in. The air like an undeniable truth. Victor, for the first time in a long while, had nothing left to say. Victor sat, motionless, Peacemaker's words echoing in his mind. It was a simple truth, yet it struck harder than anything he had heard in a long time. His entire life had been built on status, on the idea that respect came from wealth, power, and recognition. But now, sitting beside someone who had all of those things yet carried himself with complete humility, he felt something he wasn't used to. Doubt. For the rest of the flight, Victor remained quiet. He avoided meeting Peacemaker's gaze, but his thoughts were restless. The way he had acted, the way he had judged a stranger without knowing anything about him, it all felt painfully clear now. He thought back to the countless times he had done the same to others, dismissing people based on their appearance, their demeanor, or their perceived worth. How many times had he overlooked someone simply because they didn't fit into his idea of success? The flight attendant passed by once more, this time collecting empty glasses. Victor barely noticed her. His mind was elsewhere. He wanted to say something to salvage what little dignity he had left, but no words seemed enough. What could he possibly say that wouldn't sound hollow? Finally, as the plane began its descent, he took a deep breath and turned to Peacemaker. His voice was quieter, stripped of the arrogance that had once laced his words. I need to apologize, he said, not just because of who you are, but because I was arrogant. I acted like an idiot. Peacemaker studied him for a moment, then gave a small nod. I appreciate the apology, he said, but more than that, I hope you learn from this. Victor nodded slowly. He didn't know if he could change overnight, but for the first time he felt like he needed to try. As they disembarked, Victor lingered in the terminal, watching Peacemaker disappear into the crowd. Fans approached him asking for photos, and he greeted them with the same patience and kindness he had shown all along. Victor exhaled, running a hand through his hair. Maybe this encounter wasn't just a coincidence. Maybe it was a wake-up call. And maybe for the first time in his life, he was finally ready to listen. In the end, our lives are shaped by the choices we make. Do we live to impress others, or do we strive to grow into better versions of ourselves? Peacemaker's words carried a profound truth. Real success isn't measured by wealth, status, or recognition, but by the lasting impact we leave on the world and the people around us. The next time you find yourself in a situation where judgment or arrogance tempts you, remember that respect and humility never lose their value. True change begins within. If this story resonated with you, we invite you to explore more inspiring tales of kindness, resilience, and the power of human connection. Click the screen to discover more stories that will warm your heart and remind you of what truly matters.